Good morning, ladies. I'm Kelly Lightfoot, and I'm coming to you from my house while you sit in the retreat house. And I've been right where you're sitting more than a dozen times. It was nearly 4 years ago I started hosting retreats at the retreat house. And at that time, it was just my circle of friends. But now that circle has grown to include you, and I'm so glad you're here. Because of these retreats we've done year after year, and now dozens of them, I have seen God work so powerfully and very personally in the lives of every woman who attended. So I'm glad that you carved out some space. I know life is busy, everything moves fast, and I'm thankful that you're here this weekend. And it is our hope and prayer that you not only get some time to rest, but you connect with some of the ladies who are sitting beside you, and most importantly, really just get to connect with the Lord. So in considering what topic we were going to talk about for retreats this year, our team discussed a variety of options. And in the end, we decided we were going to go real deep and cut to the heart of what is really a very tender and often painful part of our faith walk, which is struggling, suffering, the trials we often have to endure. And I know that a lot of the time there's deep pain wrapped around that. And the Bible has so much to say about suffering. In fact, C.S. Lewis says, God whispers in our pleasure, he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. We could all make a long list of struggles, and we could compare those lists, and I'm sure we'd find some overlap. But there may be things on your list that would break my heart for you, things we would share that we couldn't even imagine someone having to endure. Elisabeth Elliot was a great missionary, writer and teacher, and she has a lot to say about suffering herself. She endured a lot in the course of her life, and she defines suffering. I think this is a great definition. We're going to come back to it. She says suffering is wanting what we don't have and having what we don't want. And I think that pretty much sums it up. Wanting what we don't have or having what we don't want. That really takes into consideration everything from the simplest inconvenience to the deepest wounds that we endure. And so if you're hurting or struggling, you're in the right place, and I'm thankful you're here. When I look back over the 40 years of my life, our family, our big family, extended family, has endured everything from relational brokenness, betrayal from pastors, kids who've had sickness, addiction, trauma. In my life personally, I've struggled with depression, seasons of depression and anxiety, and those worst seasons really leaving me at the doorsteps of suicide and feeling like that was my only way out. So I know we all carry something. When I was in college, I went through a devastating breakup. Now I say devastating breakup. I was 19 at the time, and so as you go along, you get a little perspective. But at that time, it was a very serious relationship I thought was going to end in marriage, and when it ended, it was very discouraging, and I was absolutely heartbroken. And I remember being at church that Sunday, and this sweet old lady asked me how I was doing, and I'm sure I was like, trying to explain to her what I was going through. And I told her the story, and she put her hand on me, and she just said, I lost my husband too. I know what heartache is like. And I just thought that kindness and compassion that she would allow me as a 19-year-old with a little bit of heartache to compare my hurt and sadness to her, what had been decades of love. It was just a kindness she extended to me. So I don't come to you because I have had the greatest suffering, but I know the greatest God like you do. And whether it's the smallest inconvenience or the darkest nights, God is faithful. And I want us to look toward that great God as we think about suffering. It's kind of like that old adage about the gospel, or just one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. And so let's go to the feast that God has prepared for his daughters. So this is a transformative truth I really want you to hold on to, which is that God doesn't always give us an explanation when we're asking why. He may not give us an explanation, but he does give us himself. And it's in that suffering that if we allow, he will usher us into the arms of Jesus, and we can find our place there. I love Deuteronomy 33:27. It says, the eternal God is a dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. I'd never really thought about the everlasting arms, and I certainly never thought about God being a place that I go to. So his answer to why is often trust me. He may not give us the explanation, but he always gives us himself in the midst of that. If you're a mother, you know this to be true. There have been times your child is hurting, and what you do is just put your arms around them and you hold them tight and you comfort them. And that comfort of your presence goes so far. That long, tight hug sometimes calms the worst of boo-boos for our children, and the Lord, as a good father, does that for us. So my hope is this weekend that we can offer you some encouragement, perhaps a little perspective, to anyone who's suffering. That's all of us. And many of us, as we walk through difficult seasons, undoubtedly, we will one day soon if we haven't already. I remember in high school, I went to a youth conference, and the pastor that night was talking about storms. And he was talking about you're either in a storm or you're getting out of a storm, or maybe you need the storm of salvation to come. And I remember that night as I was reflecting on this, thinking like, okay, where am I? Am I in a storm? I felt like the Lord say, a storm is coming and you need to anchor in. And maybe that's where you are now. Maybe things are going well. And so you can anchor in now. We can hold on to him. We can remember what is true and be ready for whatever comes next. And if we live another day, we're going to face some trials, no doubt. I'm someone who loves to read, and yes, I'm counting audiobooks as reading. I don't know if you do or not, but biographies, autobiographies, I love to read the stories of other believers, read the stories of what they've gone through and how God has been so faithful. I think we can learn a lot, but we can find ourselves in their stories. So whether it's evangelists or missionaries like Elisabeth Elliot, or just ordinary people, business people, or athletes, I love stories. And because of this one giant of the faith, Elisabeth Elliot, we're going to take a lot of cues from what she has already taught, and that's going to kind of speak to what we look at in our sessions here. So if you're not familiar with Elisabeth Elliot, her and her husband were missionaries to the jungles of Ecuador in the mid-1950s. Their hope was to bring Jesus to a tribe of people, an indigenous people there, who had not only had very little contact with the outside world, but certainly never heard the gospel of Jesus. And they hadn't been there long when Elisabeth Elliot's husband and 4 other men who had begun making contact in this tribe, all 5 men were killed by the tribe in a very sudden act of violence. But after this happened, Elisabeth found herself with her 10-month-old daughter living in Ecuador, now a single mom. And she says in those days after her husband's death, she had such immense grief partnered with the peace of God. And she stayed there, committed to her Bible translation work she was doing. And 2 years later, Elisabeth, along with her 3-year-old daughter and Rachel Saint, another missionary who had lost someone, her brother, in that same murder, they went to live. Her and Rachel went to live among the tribal people. And it was through this living with them and bringing the gospel to them that many in that tribe came to know the Lord. And even the man who murdered her husband became a friend as he came to know Christ. So Elisabeth had built her life on the obedience and goodness of God despite the terrible hardships she endured. And that loss of her husband was not her only loss. She actually went on to suffer other losses in her life. And so we can trust the things she says because she has walked this out. So there's 3 principles we're going to look at over the next 3 sessions. This is the principle of exchange, which is death always leads to life. The principle of his presence, he goes with us in our suffering. And lastly, the principle of goodness. All suffering produces fruit. This is our great hope, God's power and presence with us. So let's dive into that first point. So that brings us to our first principle, the principle of exchange, which is death leads to life. We not only see this all through scripture, but we see it in nature as well. I love what John 12:24 says. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And that's Jesus speaking. So death is the gateway to life. So think about that little seed, that hopeful tiny seed must fall to the ground, be buried in darkness and unknown, and then sustain death. But it is through that death, life comes. This kind of reminds me of grade school. I don't know if you did this, but we were given a little clear cup and we planted our seed in there and we stuck a wet paper towel to smash that seed up against the wall, and you would watch it over the days and weeks start to germinate. So that little seed would grow some roots and start to grow a shoot. And I love that. And maybe was the beginning of my love for plants. I by no means have a green thumb. My philosophy is like, kill it slow enough to enjoy it. But I loved watching those roots start to take hold. When we think about this principle of death giving way to life, the greatest example is Christ on the cross. His suffering was the greatest suffering ever endured, but yet produced the most tremendous blessing as he bought salvation for all of us, millions upon millions. By his wounds, we are healed. And those wounds didn't come gently. They came with force, abuse, and great suffering. There was transformative purpose in the suffering of Jesus. It was through the suffering we've come to know life. Hebrews 12:2 says, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross." This is the lens with which we can view suffering. We have to look to that greater hope beyond our suffering, not just our current circumstances. Jesus knew, when he was going to the cross, there was an eternal reward he was purchasing on our behalf, and that was what fueled him to endure. Several years ago, when we were expecting our daughter May, she's 8 now, so yeah, it was, I guess, 9 years ago, we had a midwife, wonderful, godly, strong woman, and she was so gracious. Of course, I would come in with my list of 20 questions that I had every checkup, and she would kindly answer all of those, and more than once, she would remind me of Jesus' suffering and what he endured. That same verse from Hebrews that said he endured and the cross set before him. And that's because of the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And so she compared the labor, the pain that goes into laboring and birth very much to the joy that's going to come just as Jesus labored, and even in him in Gethsemane, what he went through, similar to what a mother goes through in her laboring and her pains of childbirth, but that produces that bundle of joy, abundant joy, that child that's coming. So we know life comes from death, and we also know that he suffered first. This is the framework of suffering. Isaiah 53 says it so well. It talks about the Lord's suffering, and I'm just going to read just a little excerpt, just a couple verses from chapter 53 there, starting with verse 3. It says, "He was despised and rejected by man, a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief, and as one whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he bore our griefs and carried our sorrows. We esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and upon him the chastisement that brought us peace." This is our King, our leader. He suffered tremendously, and we can't expect as followers not to have our own suffering in life. We must understand this is a very real aspect of our faith. Now, I started to wonder as I prepared all this, like, okay, come to retreat. You're going to suffer. You're going to suffer. We're all going to suffer. So, that's the bad news, but we all know that it is to be true. We all know that's true. So we're going to get to the good news of what that means in it. So remember, Elizabeth Elliot said, suffering, wanting what we don't have, having what we don't want. This happens to us. Now, of course, you might have a unicorn day where you wake up before your alarm and your children are sweet and obedient and you do everything on the to-do list. But those days only come along like once a decade. All the rest of the days are going to have some level of struggle in them. Jesus said, in this world, you will have trouble. There's an anonymous quote I love, and it's talking about when Jesus fed the 5,000. They said, "If my life is broken when given to Jesus, it may be because those pieces will feed a multitude when a loaf would only have satisfied a boy." That brokenness that leads to something. Now, I'm not sure if you've heard of Franny Crosby. I love her story. She was a young woman in the early 1800s, and when she was born, she was a baby, not too many months old, when she had a illness that affected her sight. And they're really not sure if it was the illness that made her blind or the medical treatment of the illness, but after that point, she was completely blind. And at a young age, Franny began writing poems and then went on to be, and I quote, "the most prolific of all 19th century American sacred songwriters." By the end of her career, she had written 9,000 hymns. Blessed Assurance, Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior, To God Be the Glory. Do some of those sound familiar? When she was 8 years old, she wrote her first poem, and listen to what she said. Now, my daughter's 8, like I said, so I picture a bright little third grader saying this. Franny, who was blind, she said, "Oh, what a happy soul am I, although I cannot see. I've resolved that in this world contented I shall be. So many blessings I enjoy that other people don't, to weep and sigh because I'm blind. I cannot nor I won't." That was at 8. And at 8, she certainly couldn't have imagined all God was going to do through her. Franny herself once said, "It seemed intended by the blessed providence of God that I should be blind all my life, and I thank him for this dispensation. If perfect earthly sight were offered to me tomorrow, I would not accept it. I might not have sung hymns to the praise of God if I had been distracted by the beautiful and interesting things about me." Physical blindness was the gateway to her spiritual sight. She saw the world more clearly because she saw Jesus clearly. And just think back to Franny's mother. I don't know anything about her, but I can imagine being a mom myself, when you're holding a baby who's just lost their sight, you feel like the world is closing in. You can't imagine the life of suffering your daughter's going to have. And yet her mother could not have even imagined what God had in store, what God was going to do through her for his kingdom and for her good. It's estimated that books containing the lyrics Franny wrote have sold more than 100 million copies. And I think about myself as a girl growing up in the 80s and 90s in church, singing those hymns, my seeds of faith growing because of the things she had written herself. What a tremendous impact. The acceptance of a life of suffering, as we come to accept that, is quickly followed by this powerful truth that suffering will be the gateway to this more brilliant life, one filled with the presence of Jesus and being used by him for his kingdom.